Okay, everybody, in this presentation, we're going to be talking about logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are common points at which logic breaks down. They are things that people use in their arguments to seem convincing, but aren't actually convincing if you stop and think about the argument that's being created. We're going to continue to look at the Toulmin model in analyzing these logical fallacies, because the errors in logical fallacies very frequently take place in that warrant section of the Toulmin argument, where the evidence makes sense, and if you believe the warrant that's being employed, you will come to that conclusion. But typically in a logical fallacy, there's a problem in that warrant that needs to be examined. So looking at logical fallacies is also a good way to practice analyzing things according to the Toulmin model. So we're going to start by looking at what's called the either-or fallacy, or what is sometimes called false dilemma. In the either-or fallacy, the speaker presents you with only two options and tries to make you believe that you have to choose between those two options. So they end up with a claim that you should do or believe thing X, whatever that might be, and they provide you details about thing X and thing Y and point out that X is superior to Y. The only way this argument works is if you accept the warrant that there are only two choices. So, for example, if I said to you, you can either do your homework or you can drop out of school and become a bum. That argument is convincing as long as you believe that either doing homework or dropping out of school and wasting your life are the only two options. But I would have difficulty proving that. I would have difficulty finding backing for my warrant that there are really only two choices. And you should rebut that by saying, well, what about choice Z? What if I, don't do my homework, but I invent a personal computer in my garage or something like that? And I would have a difficult time maintaining my position. I would have to qualify it pretty far because I was misleading you, intentionally or not, by falling victim to the either-or fallacy. So, for example, in this illustration, and this is an argument we hear a lot about patriotism, that you either love your country or you should leave, or you love the current state of your country or you should leave. That's an either-or option. It ignores that maybe it's possible for the country to change in some way. This is a very famous old example of potentially the either-or fallacy, a political cartoon from the Revolutionary War, in which the two choices that are presented are the colonies coming together as one unit or dying. Possibly there's something in between that could have been done. So when someone presents you with the either-or fallacy, think about what's a third option, or potentially, why not have both? The next logical fallacy that we're going to talk about is the slippery slope. In a slippery slope argument, someone tries to convince you that if you do one thing, there is some inevitable consequence of it. So they're going to try to convince you that you should or should not do something. You should or should not do choice X. And their evidence is that Y and Z are bad and are somehow related to X. The warrant for a slippery slope argument is going to be that X invariably leads to Y and to Z. That when you do this thing, it's going to guarantee to lead to those other consequences. So if I was to say to you, if you don't do your homework tonight, then before you know it, you won't be ever doing your homework, and then you're going to flunk, and then you're going to drop out of school, and then you're going to become a bum on the street, apparently. In which case, I'm employing the slippery slope fallacy. I have a hard time backing up that there is no way for you to interrupt what's happening after X, but before you get to Z. You should rebut that by saying, well, what if you were able to stop after X happened? And I would have to qualify my argument pretty far and get away from that slippery slope. A famous example of the slippery slope argument is in the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. And in that book, if you're not familiar with it, you give a mouse a cookie, and then he demands some milk, and then he wants, a Subway sandwich or something, and before too long, you have to give the mouse your entire home, and he has taken over your life entirely. There's probably somewhere that you could have stopped after you gave the mouse a cookie and before you signed over power of attorney to him. We're going to talk about scare tactics as a kind of logical fallacy. Once again, someone's trying to convince you to do or not do something, to believe something, or to take an action. And the way, when they're using scare tactics, the way they try to get you to do that is by pointing out that there might very well be scary consequences if you don't do the thing they want you to do or do the thing they don't want you to do. Their argument, the warrant that connects their evidence about the scary consequences to you needing to do or not do the thing is that you have to avoid scary things at all costs. So I'm using scare tactics if I say, if you don't do your English homework, just imagine all the horrible things that will happen to you and how awful your life will be and how embarrassed your parents will be and all those kinds of awful things will happen unless you do what you have to do. But maybe just because something's scary or intimidating, it's not something that you have to avoid. You could rebut that by saying, well, what if there are benefits to doing this thing that seems scary? What if there are ways to limit the risks? What are the odds of the scary thing actually happening to me? I'm going to have to convince you logically, not just relying on emotional arguments. So like in this ad where they're trying to get you to watch your diet because the alternative is death. They're attempting to scare you with this. Now, obviously, it's probably a good idea to keep an eye on your cholesterol, but this is not a logical argument about the realistic odds of you having these sorts of health problems. They're trying to scare you with this very graphic image. Another common logical fallacy that we need to talk about is the bandwagon appeal. This is one you're probably familiar with. In bandwagon appeal, once again, people are trying to convince you of their claim that you should do some particular thing. And their evidence is that it's popular or it's not popular. Now, you've been taught this for a long time. The warrant of this argument, the reason that the evidence that lots of people are doing something leads to the claim that you should do it is that you should do what's popular. You have a really hard time backing that up, and you should rebut that by saying, well, what if all those people are wrong? And of course, I need to acknowledge that just because something is or isn't popular doesn't mean it's the right or wrong thing to do. A very common example of the bandwagon appeal is McDonald's advertising that they've served over 99 billion hamburgers. It doesn't mean that any of the 99 billion people who bought one of those were making a good decision. So they're attempting to manipulate you using the bandwagon appeal. Okay, the next logical fallacy I want to talk about is the appeal to false authority. In the appeal to false authority, someone wants to convince you that you should or should not do something. And the way they go about doing that is by saying that someone who's an authority on something has their opinion about this, that some authority somewhere believes the same thing that they do. But you have to evaluate whether the person they're citing as an authority actually knows something about issue X, right? So I'm your English teacher. I don't know that I'm really someone you should look to for an opinion about like which car to buy or something like that, right? Just because I have authority, because I have expertise in one area, doesn't give me expertise in all areas. When someone makes an appeal to false authority, they're using the warrant that skill in one area or knowledge in one area equals skill or knowledge in all areas, which obviously should be questioned. Virtually all advertising is built around appeals to false authority, or at least a huge amount of it is. Peyton Manning is very good at playing football. I have no idea if he's good at picking out delivery pizza or not. But Papa John seems to think that they can use the fact that he's a good football player to convince me to buy their pizzas. I should question, why does Peyton Manning know so much about pizza? Maybe he doesn't. Just because he's good at throwing a football doesn't mean he's good at ordering pizza. Right? So that's an appeal to false authority that would need to be qualified. And here's just a random example I found. Just because Michael Phelps is good at swimming does not necessarily mean that he's good at deciding where the best place to get a sandwich is. The next one that we're going to talk about is dogmatism. People rely on dogmatism in arguments where they try to convince you that usually these have to do with something being true because people have always believed that it's true. The warrant there is that knowledge never changes, that common knowledge isn't ever wrong, right? So dogma is commonly accepted or commonly held beliefs, and an appeal that relies on dogmatism argues that because we've always thought this way, that's the way we should always continue to think. Hard to back that up. You should challenge that with your rebuttal and say, well, what if we're wrong? And it's pretty difficult sometimes to prove. As an easy example, a famous idea of an earlier kind of dogma was that the Earth was at the center of the universe. People were tortured and put to death and things for believing against that dogma, or that the world was flat or something like that. Those are much earlier examples of dogma. We hear dogma all the time, maybe not to the extremes that are in these pictures, but you still need to be aware of, is someone actually proving something or just relying on the fact that everyone assumes that that thing is true? The next logical fallacy we're going to talk about is the appeal to moral equivalence. In an argument about moral equivalence, someone's going to try to convince you that two things are equally bad. They're equivalently immoral. So this is an argument that comes up when someone's trying to convince you that someone or something is a really terrible thing. And the evidence that they are going to present is that thing X is bad and thing Y is bad. The warrant of the argument when it comes to moral equivalence is that all bad things are equally bad, which is very difficult to support. And you should challenge that by saying, well, isn't there some variation in how bad things are, which is a difficult thing to qualify. So in an appeal or an argument built around moral equivalence, we see these a lot in political rhetoric. Here's an example of a political ad that is comparing Barack Obama to Joseph Stalin. Even if you happen to believe that Barack Obama has done some bad things, it's not very fair to say that he did things that were just as bad as Joseph Stalin, who did kill millions of people. Similarly, here is a sign someone's holding comparing Bush's invasion of Iraq to Hitler's invasion of Poland. Even if you think that the invasion of Iraq was a bad idea, it's pretty hard to say that it was as bad a thing as Hitler invading Poland. So moral equivalency arguments try to convince you that if something about something that you like or want to do is bad, it's just as bad as the worst thing they can imagine, which isn't always true. Always keep in mind, hyperbole is worse than Hitler. The next logical fallacy we're going to talk about is what's called an ad hominem fallacy. In an ad hominem fallacy, someone is going to attack an idea, try to convince you that something is not true or is a bad idea. And the way that they do it is by arguing that X's proponent, that the person who's in favor of this, has some sort of personal flaws. Ad hominem means to the man or to the person. An ad hominem attack is based not around proving that an idea is flawed, but around proving that the person arguing for it has some problem. And the warrant of that becomes flawed people cannot have good ideas, which is obviously very difficult to prove. What if that person's still correct, even if they are reprehensible in some other way, right? So an ad hominem attack, here's an ad hominem attack against President Obama that points out that even though some things were successful in his first term, he has this image of being kind of elitist and took an expensive vacation, so what he says is bad. Likewise, there were quite a few ad hominem attacks leveled against Mitt Romney in the most recent political campaign because of his wealth. That it became a personal attack that because he was wealthy, he was, his message and ideas were somehow flawed. So in an ad hominem attack, we attack the person instead of the person's ideas. As in this, what I always think is hilarious cartoon. Another logical fallacy that we're going to talk about is what's called a hasty generalization. You have to make generalizations in life sometimes. If you touch one hot stove and get burned, you have to be able to generalize that all hot stoves are probably things that you shouldn't touch. But a hasty generalization occurs when you come to that conclusion too rapidly. If you immediately come to the conclusion that Y is always true of X based on the evidence that in some sort of small sample size, Y was true of X. So you're creating the warrant that your particular sample size is large enough to draw a conclusion, which it very well might not be. You have to dig a little deeper and say, well, has Y ever not been true of X? What if we look at more examples before we draw this generalization? So the hasty generalization is what most advertising about the lottery, for example, is built around. They'll point to an example of one person who won millions and millions of dollars and try to convince you that it's a good idea to play the lottery, even though there's quite a few people who played who didn't win. Let's talk about mistaken causality. The Latin phrase up there, post hoc ergo propter hoc, means after this, therefore because of this. When someone builds an argument around mistaken causality or post hoc ergo propter hoc, they're going to be arguing that something caused something else to happen. X caused Y to happen. And the evidence that they use for that is that X and Y happened in sequence, that event X happened and then event Y happened. The warrant there is that there's no other possible relationship between X and Y, which is difficult to prove. You should question things and say, is there another factor that could have caused that to happen? Might they be unrelated? Which is difficult to qualify then. Most superstitions are the result of mistaken causality. If I break a mirror and then something awful happens to me, and I say, oh, that happened because I broke the mirror, I'm committing the logical fallacy of mistaken causality. An interesting example of mistaken causality in medicine, it's fairly common for older people to fall and break their hips. But actually, doctors and scientists have determined that what typically happens is the person breaks their hip, which then causes them to fall. So for years and years and years, people thought that things were happening in the opposite order than they really were. Here's a cartoon that illustrates that it might be possible to use mistaken causality to convince yourself that the rooster crowing causes the sun to rise. Also, this graph illustrates that as the number of pirates worldwide has decreased, the global temperature has increased, though clearly the number of pirates does not actually cause the global temperature to change. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is maybe the hardest one to understand, and that's the logical fallacy begging the question. People today often misuse the phrase begging the question. They say begging the question when they really mean raising the question. And if you're begging the question, you're in fact doing the opposite. You're actually sort of trying to hide the question. If you're begging the question, you want me to believe your claim that X proves Y, that like Y is true because of X. And the way you prove that, the evidence that you supply, is that Y proves X, that X is true because of Y. That's a circular argument. In this argument, the unproven elements are being used to prove the other unproven elements. You supply this warrant that no additional evidence is needed when more clearly is needed in order to prove this. A common example that I have run into, let's say once or twice in my teaching career, is a student will come to me and say, you gave me a C on this paper. I don't deserve a C. I'm an A student. In that argument, they're not really supplying any evidence about the quality of the paper. If you think about it, they're giving me two different unproven elements. This is an A paper. I'm an A student. The evidence for them being an A student is that they should get A's on their papers. The evidence for them needing an A on their paper is that they're an A student. That argument goes in a circle. There's no real evidence being supplied. That student is begging the question. They're not giving any backing for their warrant that no additional evidence is needed about the quality of their writing. I might say, well, what if both are false? What if you're not an A student and that paper doesn't deserve an A, right? I'm pointing out the fact that you're begging the question, and you will have to qualify your response. You'll actually have to go into your paper and prove to me that you deserve the A, which maybe you might do because you're all very, intelligent students. This might come up if you and I are walking down the street and we see a homeless person, and you say to me, goodness, look at that homeless person. They must have made some terrible decisions in their life to end up homeless. And I say, how do you know that they made terrible decisions? And you say, well, look, they're homeless, aren't they? In that argument, you're using two unproven elements to prove each other. Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning works because circular reasoning works, and it works because circular reasoning works. The argument moves in a circle. Maybe the most famous example of begging the question comes from one of the most important songs of the early 2000s, the song This Is Why I'm Hot by Mims, in which Mims argues that he's hot because he's fly, and he's fly because he's hot. If you stop and think about it, he's not proving either element of his argument. Mims is begging the question. Okay, begging the question was hard. False analogy is going to be a bit easier. In a false analogy, someone's trying to convince you that what is true for X is also true for Y. And their evidence is that X and Y share some properties. So they create an analogy between two things. And they try to use that analogy to prove to you that what was good for one thing is good for the other thing. The warrant of that argument is that there are no significant differences between X and Y, which isn't always the case. If you have an older sibling, you may very well have fallen victim to this logical fallacy. If you had a teacher say, well, your brother always did his work, why can't you? Or something like that. Sure, there are similarities between you and your brother, but there are also a lot of differences, and it's not fair to hold you to these same exact standards all the time. So that argument's built around a false analogy. It's lacking real backing about the common characteristics that you share. What about this other thing that we don't have in common? Right, and so that becomes difficult to qualify. As an example, a common argument that you'll hear today is comparing schools and businesses. And if I wanted to make a false analogy, I could say something like, well, businesses are allowed to fire underperforming employees. So as a teacher, I should be allowed to expel students who don't maintain at least a B in my class. That's a false analogy. If you buy into my premise that schools and businesses are just like each other, then the argument makes sense. But clearly there are key differences between businesses and schools. They have different motivations, for example, businesses existing to make a profit and schools existing to make people smarter. Okay, we're going to throw out a few more right here at the end that don't fit the Toulmin model quite as well, so I'm going to stop laying these out in terms of Toulmin flowcharts. But these are a few more logical fallacies that you might see a lot. One of them is equivocation. In equivocation, you play with the definitions of words. So, as an example of equivocation, I could make the argument that the image that you see there on the screen is a balanced breakfast. And it is a balanced breakfast because there are quite a few different kinds of things in relatively equal proportions. But most of the time, when people refer to a balanced breakfast, they mean one that's healthy, and clearly that's not a healthy breakfast. So if I use the word balanced breakfast to refer to that, I'm playing with the definitions of the words. I'm sort of using a different definition than what's typically accepted or than what's expected in that situation to convince you of something. Here's an old ad for Coke where it says it's the real thing, and it puts it in the context here of all sorts of fresh fruits and cheeses and things. Real is being used to mean several different things in this ad. The fruits and cheeses are obviously more real than Coke in the sense that they come, naturally from plants and things like that. When they say that Coke is the real thing, they're using a word more like genuine or something there, an alternate definition of real to confuse the issue. Another logical fallacy I briefly want to touch on is the straw man argument. A straw man argument is where you misrepresent your opponent's position to make it easier to attack. In your argument, you say that my opponent is saying things that your opponent didn't really say, but you put those words in their mouth because it then becomes easy for you to tear it apart like a straw man, like a scarecrow. Here's this screenshot from Bill O'Reilly, where he's arguing against an idea that his political opponents want to mandate the government to buy people gin or cocaine or pay the bills of lazy people. I'm going to go ahead and say that that specific argument has never been advanced by one of Bill O'Reilly's opponents, but he frames it that way because it makes it much easier to take apart. The last one that I want to talk about is non sequitur. Non sequitur is the last Latin phrase we're going to talk about. It literally means does not follow. A non sequitur might be like a red herring argument, where you ignore what the person wants to talk about and talk about something else entirely. So in this cartoon, you see that the person wants to talk about the environment and the other person says, we can't talk about the environment, we're in the middle of a war. So they're introducing a totally different issue, an issue that doesn't follow, in order to avoid talking about something that maybe they're less well prepared to talk about. They have no idea what the person's talking about, so they present Bunny with the pancakes on its head. An example of a non sequitur that will wrap up our discussion of various logical fallacies.